for me.
All right. So, first question, just thinking about again, like incorporating different movement, um, sort of concepts and models. Like, how do you integrate concepts taken from FRC versus the intensive versus PRI? Where's the carryover, and what are some of the commonalities between these? I guess.
Well, so was it like the PRI stuff and the intensive? It's definitely like they're similar, and I don't want to step at a turn and say that they're definitely not the same thing. But without my coursework in PRI, I would have been very lost with anything in the intensive. So
Mhm.
it was just with the idea of asymmetry and all of that in the body and why that occurs. I would have just been kind of lost if I didn't have the PRI work. So
Right.
there, right there, there's just this idea of the fact that we're not symmetrical internally, and the fact that like our internal movements are important, and we in many other models orthopedically we don't tend to take that into consideration of how important it is, the fact that just you and I sitting here right now, there's movement going on within our body that affects what's going on externally too. So both of those systems, explain that and go into that. I would say the Bill's intensive model goes into that a bit deeper, but it is similar, and I think it was very helpful to have a background in PRI to start to decipher any of Bill's stuff.
Hmm.
Um, for all of those three models, though, I think the one of the major commonalities is that there is a respect for how the breath and directed directed muscle contractions work to try to change positions. So in the intensive and PRI, like there's a good head to toe understanding of relationships in the body that you can really appreciate and use as like a starting point of assessment and start to make more sense out of some of the presentations that you might see a patient or client have. And really it's this kind of kinetic chain idea, um, but it ultimately is understanding how to use the breath and connect that to also muscle contractions that would be directed to try to improve position or to change position depending on what somebody is limited with. That also is within FRC quite a bit. It's different. I would say that the FRC stuff from what I've gone through is not as it's not as specific, looking at the asymmetries in the body. Like they don't really go into that as much, but they do talk a bit about how to use the breath to create irradiation, which then creates this sort of center out motion or dissociation of one joint from the other by being able to maintain control of your middle. And that's definitely within both. And then using not just isometric contraction, but really understanding that you can direct that isometric force to create more motion in where you need it or where you're limited with it.
Hmm.
Right. So if you think about something like the hip shift, which is, like a foundation of PRI stuff, there's directed isometric contractions that allow that to happen, connected to the breath. And the breath itself, has directed isometric contractions in it. So if you contract, you inhale, you contract the diaphragm where you're already directing pressure and you're directing motion. But then depending on how you use the exhale, that's the beginning of any, directed muscle contraction that can then try to change joint position. So that's in all three of those. And I think it's just a matter of appreciating them for what they are, like the base categories of that, or like that breath matters and how you use the breath will change
Hmm.
how you can actually move your joints. And then thinking about what direction are you actually trying to move and what muscle contractions correspond to that.
Hmm.
The FRC talks a lot about, especially if you listen to Dr. Spina, like go out into some of his stuff that he talks about with YouTube, or on YouTube, is that it's really important to actually contemplate the direction that you're trying to move, not just like create a external cue of contracting like one muscle like on one side of the joint and then one on the other. Like if you're trying to improve internal rotation of a hip, you have to actually visualize what internal of the hip would be in the position that you're in, and then that actually matters for how much you're going to get out of that exercise. And I think that's really important, and I do think that's in all of those models, is that you get this better vision of what direction you're actually trying to move your body and where you're limited, so then you can guide your exercises that way, which again, these exercises have just some version of controlling the breath and controlling directed isometric contractions.
Have you ever thought about like directly incorporating, I'm thinking of doing, say you're doing standing hip cars or something.
Mm-hmm.
Is there value in trying to incorporate like a hip shift into that when you're going into internal rotation and then getting that reaching out of the socket when you're, going towards hip extension to a certain extent?
Absolutely. So, and I do that all the time. So if you take the idea of the asymmetry that's, within PRI, you may now just have a different starting point in your head when you're doing all of your cars, right? So if you know that you're, say, oriented to the right more than you're to the left, and you have the references for how to orient yourself back to the left, well, like you may just start from that position, like that you feel like, okay, I'm going to say you're standing, I'm going to be more on my outer left heel. Yep. And when I'm doing anything, if I'm doing a hip car on the right, I'm still going to be oriented with outer left heel contact, left internal oblique engagement, right? But I'm moving the right hip around that feeling, those references that you would use. Yeah, it makes sense to do that. And you can do it both ways. You can see how it feels not doing that, and you can see how it feels doing that. So you just incorporate that together. And ultimately, like, you're your own case study. But if you don't have the education of those relationships, you'd never even think to go there. You never even think about the difference. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's no reason not to just add the idea of, say, pails and rails right to a hip shift too, right? So you can use the hip shift is sort of, it's compressive on one side and it's expansive on the other side, right? So you can use the idea of both sides, like just to, try to create an expansive isometric, just to see what that feels like in different positions. So say you're in your 90-90, Z-sit position, just reach both hips long, engage, try to find both like glute max muscles, and see what that feels like, and then do both sides compressive, feeling more like adductors and trying to, bias the exhale a little bit more, see what that feels like. And then you can go, all right, on the side that I'm trying to promote external rotation, I create more of an expansive reach, while the other side I'm creating more of a compressive contraction, like into the socket. There's all isometric, right? And in some ways there's a version of pails and rails right in there, right? Yeah. It's just that you might be doing the opposite on one side versus the other, and that creates a rotational moment in the body. So the way that I think that they describe that in FRC is more that it's just like, if you're trying to, say, move the left leg into internal rotation and your right leg is in that more externally rotated position, you have to make sure you don't lose the position of the right leg when you're trying to move the left. So in a way, that is like an expansive contraction. That is like you're trying to irradiate all of your muscles to maintain that position. But in essence, if you are keeping that leg on the ground while you're trying to compressively internally rotate the other side, you are creating a relative expansion on that side, or you're maintaining a relative expansion. So it's just a language difference sometimes, or a focus difference. But I think the more right, the more education you have, the more you can be specific with it. And for me, it's really important not to try to make anything be the right model, right? It's because if you go down that path too much, you lose the value of what you had before with the other model, right? And that happens a lot, especially when you learn from these really smart people, and they have their own language about how they think of the body. And it makes a lot of sense. And then you're like, oh, like that, this is the way, this is the only way. And, you start to discount some of the other stuff that you learned that was valuable, because when you get out of the continuing education weekend and you have to go back and you got people in front of you, you realize like people are very complex, and especially when there's pain involved, you need a lot of different ways to go about things. So you don't want to discount anything. You want to find the commonalities, and then based on how simple or complex something is, that might be something that's really simple might be better for some people, right? Even though that you can go a bit more complex now because you've gotten new concepts. It's nice to be able to have different ways to display that. And I think when I get into some of these deeper models of like understanding the relationships of the body, it's very, very helpful, but I don't always have to go there. You know what I mean? But to know those relationships in a way that I didn't know them before is always valuable, because it's like, okay, this is where I still need to go sometimes. But if you got somebody in pain and you can get them started with just like actually creating like an isometric contraction on the opposite side of the joint that's painful, sometimes that just changes the pain right there. And you've already started the process of helping them control their stuff. And then it's just a matter of like, how much more do you got to do for someone? Like, what are their goals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just nice to have all these models working for you, and seeing how they do intertwine, but you often don't need to go super deep.
Right.
For everybody.
That sort of ties into my next thought was, like, depending on the client's goals, if you have a training client coming in, say they're lacking, some specific range of motion that, people would say is a prerequisite for an activity. When do you, like, sort of, how do you determine when you're going to stay away from that particular activity versus when you're going to train into it? Do you always wait till they get that full, whatever, range of motion to perform that activity, like, quote unquote, perfectly, even though there's no such thing? Sort of just, how do you know when to work into it and when to avoid that, especially if it's a training client who's not necessarily in pain?
Yeah, let's try to go after like a specific example. So should we talk like, say, like overhead range of motion?
Overhead is good.
Or like overhead pressing, or something like that.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. So I mean, that would be one example. I mean, I would say I don't want to say change my stance on this, but I think I understand this, or I look at this differently now than I have over the past several years, because different models will present this in different ways. And I think when you get it presented in a model, a lot of times it's like, well, if you don't have the full range of motion, then it's just obvious that you shouldn't load it. Right? It's just because it's going to be some type of compensation pattern, and somebody's going to get hurt. And that makes a lot of sense. However, in my experience with work that's overhead, or different movements such as like, all right, so let's say kettlebell snatching, barbell snatching, any type of work that ends up getting overhead, the people that I know that do that well, and that they have a nice training regimen for that, if I put them on a table and I measure their range of motion, they don't have it. So it's like there's this paradox there, that people that are, even the people that are teaching the model, don't have the range of motion that they're trying to tell you that you need to have to do this safely. Yet they still have a program for that. And myself included, it's like I would, if I had to basically say I need full overhead range of motion in my shoulder to press a kettlebell or get a kettlebell overhead, I would never do it. But I do it all the time, and it's not a thing that harms me. So I think you just have to appreciate that there will be compensations, right? But that is different. Like, that's part of the exercise in a way, right? Like, so when you have a barbell overhead, it's not the same thing as having a single kettlebell overhead. When you are just, lying on your back and having somebody test your range of motion overhead, that's not the same thing as putting a kettlebell overhead. So to me, it's important to know the difference, but not to say that you need one before you do the other. Now, how do you keep it safe? Well, we talked about this when we were talking about pain. For one thing, I do think that we kind of put on the pedestal the idea of pain prevention or injury prevention. Like we talk about it and we have models for it, but I don't think we actually are necessarily doing it, or that those models can be looked at and say that they definitely prevent injury, just because there's so many variables to what's going to create somebody's pain or just actually cause an injury, that go way beyond, just if they have enough range of motion. And because there's a lot of people that will get very little symptoms doing overhead work, even though they don't have full motion. So I think we have to look at that differently. If somebody does have pain, then I'm going to look at their range of motion and say, well, let's try to gain you some range of motion before you are doing maybe as heavy as you were doing before. But we can still usually take the movement that was provocative and put it in a continuum and say, let's find the version of this that you can do pain-free. I think that's super valuable, instead of saying let's wait on doing anything that looks like this exercise until you have full range of motion that you may never gain no matter what we do.
Yeah.
Right? Because I just think that's the reality that I've seen with people, is that there's people that just don't get this range. And the other paradox that I see is people that do heavy stuff tend to have less motion. Right. They're more concentrically oriented and things like that. But in people that are going overhead more frequently, it's the people that you see with full shoulder range of motion might be like a yogi or something like that, although they certainly have their own compensations too. But it's like the people that do the least of the overhead work are the ones that will tend to have the best range of motion. So that there's a paradox there. Not everybody is destroying their shoulders by doing overhead work. It needs to be thought of as what's the whole of your movement routine, right? So if you're doing pain-free overhead work with not full range of motion, but then you balance it out with a lot of work that you're trying to improve your motion, that's a totally different thing than saying you're just doing heavy stuff overhead and you have no balance for that. You have no balancing regimen of trying to improve that motion. So I just think that needs to all be taken into consideration. So for me, movement variability is always the thing that's at the top of trying to mitigate injury. I'm not going to use the word prevent it, but just to decrease risk, because I just think it makes the most sense. When we think about overuse, just the term overuse, we have to think about, what are we doing too much of, and how can we vary that up? So if you vary things, you by nature will do less of the same thing. Right. So that's what I would look at. So if you're worried about it, then it's just, you take yourself through a continuum, right? You make sure that nothing is hurting in the moment, but then you might go slow before you go fast. Right. So you can, really feel the angle of it. You can feel if anything, doesn't feel healthy or safe. And then you go progressive overload, right? You don't necessarily go as heavy as you can all the time. You work on different versions of an overhead press, right? A single arm kettlebell press is very different than a barbell press. But you can go a lighter press going with a slower tempo is different than going as heavy as you can and just trying to get it up there. Right? And I think the closer you get to a max effort with anything, one, you're not gonna be at your full capacity of range of motion when you're going with a max effort of load.
And you wouldn't want to be either.
You wouldn't want to be, right? So you're not going to be there. You can say theoretically that you want a buffer zone for mobility, right? To do that. And that's great if you have it, but I don't think it's a prerequisite to actually be able to attempt, that type of training. But then you can also just look at mess with tempo and mess with angles of the same idea, just to see does any of that feel like it would be problematic for you? But in that messing with different angles and different tempos, you're also training the shoulder to be a bit more robust, right? Because it's not just about range of motion. You know what I mean? It's about how do you sequence, a load overhead, right? If somebody's stronger, oftentimes they're just better at sequencing their body in the long run, like, to get something overhead. That can be part of it, or you can be just totally leveraging yourself in a certain way. So when you start messing with tempo, and you cue maybe the center a little bit more, like you have different focuses with the same movement. Now you give people the awareness of the difference. Like if somebody only has the option to press something up overhead by like leaning back really far because they're so limited with motion, and they don't have any understanding of their middle,
Mhm.
then I think it's a good idea to give them that focus, right, and have them do that. So that speaks to variability, though, right? Like, so something that looks like the same exercise can be varied many ways, and still kind of keep it within the category of the exercise.
Mhm. It's interesting to think about the sort of like you were saying, the paradox between movement options, variability, and then strength in a sense, just because I'm thinking back to like you probably wouldn't want that full range of motion pressing overhead because if you have so many different options to get a max lift overhead, like you're probably just not going to be that strong versus like I feel like to a certain extent, I don't know if this makes sense, but like a lack of variability, it's almost training, like you're just getting better at that one specific pattern and like grooving it more, which is partially maybe why you're stronger in a
Yeah,
certain
at that pattern, right? Because the
yeah.
specificity matters. But I also just I think that there's certain joint angles, like at the overhead. If you create a little bit of internal rotation, you're probably going to be more stable. Although that you're losing what would be the full joint motion,
Yep.
quote unquote, right? Like to be able to go fully overhead with full external rotation, that's often what there's value of getting that from other reasons, especially if we look at it from a expansion compression idea. But nobody goes there when they're lifting heavy, because now it's a different thing, right? When you add all of that resistance, your goal is to now be able to stabilize that resistance or move that resistance. So you don't necessarily want the most mobile joint position. You want the one that stabilizes and does the task, right? So and just because you lose some range of motion doesn't mean that you're like putting your bones together either. So I think that's the image that needs to be understood, and that most heavy lifting has some type of compensatory pattern in it, and that's fine. So to me, it's just about knowing the difference,
Hmm.
right? And we've talked about this with like hypertrophy training and things like that. It's like when you start to define your intent and you say like, I want to get more stress to my body, and then I want my body to respond to that stress so it can get bigger. It's not about technique then. Like hypertrophy and technique don't necessarily go hand in hand. You know what I mean? It's just doing the work, right? And you've done the like 30-30 workouts, the Pat Davidson stuff, and like when you get towards the end of those time periods, like it's not about like maintaining your form. It's about like, all right, can I get the 15 reps in 30 seconds? And oftentimes, like you'll get more out of it from a hypertrophy standpoint if you cheat a little bit, whatever that means, right? If you lose postural control to try to complete that more reps than just saying like, oh, I lost my form, so I'm done here.
Hmm.
Right? Now we can debate whether that's safe or not, you know what I mean? But that's not the intention there. Like safety is not the intention, right? And so there's always a balance there, and you have to say like, how robust do I feel to
Hmm.
when I'm doing this type of work, right? I think when we look outside of like an individual, like when we're trying to give general recommendations, we don't want to be that callous and say like, well, you have to be a little bit more robust to be able to tolerate this exercise, right? Or like to try to tolerate this work, but like I can't guarantee you're not going to hurt yourself. Like you don't want to say that when you're giving general recommendations, but that we know that when like if you're training yourself and you have a training background, you know like what's less likely to create stress in a way that might be injurious, and what's more likely. right? And there's a certain amount of confidence that you have to have in your own body to say, like, I want to push this because, and I know that might increase my risk, but I'm okay with that because I don't think it actually will increase it that much because I have that much confidence in my own sort of robustness,
Hmm.
right? And I think if we really think about that, we all have a little bit of that, right? And some people don't, and that's part of what like our job would be. If somebody doesn't have that, well, we don't want to throw them into a mass training routine. You know what I mean? It really it becomes about like what's the priority for this person that's in front of you. When you're training yourself, you have a training age and you have a training history, you know a little bit more about like what you think you're ready for,
Hmm.
right? But it's always about that, and I don't think you can have like these specific rules that say like, well, they don't have range of motion here, that they shouldn't be doing that. It
Right.
may give you a little bit of like backtracking to say, all right, somebody's in pain doing this thing, and then I look and they have no motion in their shoulder. It's like makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know that the other way around works, where it's like if they don't have the motion, that they shouldn't do something.
Hmm.
I
Well,
certainly I don't look at it that way.
I was gonna say if that's the case, I don't know how I would train. I don't know.
Exactly.
Like I
I don't know how I would. And so, and here's the other thing: when you look at mobility, it's like you don't know somebody's history. You don't know like what they used to be from a
Mhm.
mobility standpoint and what they are now. So, I mean, I have much more mobility in most of my joints than I did like when I was 18, probably because I just didn't work on it. And but I'm working, but the fact that I'm working on that doesn't mean that I go on a table and it's perfect. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Right.
And I think there's more value in the fact that there's a practice that's been going on with loaded overhead stuff than not. And I would say like something like a snatch or even like a push press versus like a strict press, they're totally different when it comes to what's going on with the shoulder. And I've just been exploring this with some of my older clients, you know, older 60 plus and things like that I know have shoulder limitations. And we're working on the shoulder limitations in other things, like we have been for years.
Right.
But it's been like one of those things where it's like I think that they could do a little bit of work because we've been doing so much kettlebell work for years that I think they can start, you know, playing around with, can we get the bell overhead and see what that's like. And what I've found is that like something like a push press, it clears a lot of areas where people would have pain or where they would have like impingement, and when they get overhead they're actually feel good. And then if they do more reps of that, where it's the hips that are driving the movement more than the shoulder muscles, it actually
Mhm.
starts to make their shoulder feel a bit better. And that, I'm not going to say it's making it more mobile, but
Yeah.
from a one psychological standpoint, but two just from a like if I ask someone like how does your shoulder feel, like oh it feels great, right? And it's like I'm not leaving it there. That's not their therapy, but it's just like now they can do that training. They
Mhm.
feel like they're more robust, right? They're doing more. They thought they were limited, and then they realized they weren't. That's the other thing. And then it just becomes okay. Now it's in a program. Like you're not going to give them the heaviest way possible, but you're just saying, okay, like this is something you can do. We've tested it out. We were cautious with it. Now you feel fine with it. It's not making anything worse. It wasn't worse the next day, and you actually said it makes you feel a little bit better the more you do. Like let's put this in a program and build it up because now you just have more capacity to do more things. All right, we could still balance it out in other ways, right? Like if we're getting extra, say, compressive compensations here or somewhere, you know, in the backside of the dorsal rostral region in doing that, then we work on that separately, right? But
Mhm.
all of that has to be taken into account.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
I'm thinking about the push press versus a strict press. Is part of that, do you think part of that is just because you're somewhat unloaded throughout that mid range to a certain extent?
Yeah. So when you think about like a good strict press too, the way that it's taught, you know, certainly in strong first, is that there's this irradiation from the center out, right? And when you get that right, it almost feels like there's an explosiveness from the middle. Like you can feel you're not bending your knees or anything like that. You're not jumping up, but you're squeezing your muscles in the right sequence at the right time that almost makes it explode up a little bit more. So like the cue might be like drive your feet through the ground, which then cues a core brace and a glute contraction at the same time. And it feels like a version of what a push press is. The push press just actually creates a motion, right? There's a down and up, and then you're trying to create a hip extension when you're coming up. So with the strict press, it's more of an isometric hip extension. Like you're enhancing your hip extension because you're going core, which prevents like lumbar extension, with glutes at the same time. So that idea of pushing the feet through the ground, right? Think of that as the idea of reaching. It's a glute max cue,
Yep.
right? You're reaching the leg long, but you're reaching both down through the ground as the weight's coming up. So it's like you're moving your body under the belt. It makes it feel like you're using less of your shoulder. So it makes the weight feel heavier. Well, when you actually add the down and up, the dip and drive, it's less about the shoulder. It's more about the hips. So that's always the intention, I think, is to try to get it more about the center, get it more about your middle, because it's more of a shared load, and that would make sense that you're not putting too much stress on any one area because you're sharing the load through your body better.
Right. So two thoughts going off that. Do you think, like, if you're looking at pelvic diaphragm pelvic mechanics, do you think if you're just a strict press with that cue push through the floor, are you creating do you think you're creating ascension of the pelvic diaphragm from that, or is that not possible because you're not actually moving?
No, I mean, the depends on how you breathe, right?
Yeah.
So if you are creating a exhalation strategy, which is typically what is done, or some version of it. So even if you're doing a Valsalva maneuver,
you're exhaling on a closed glottis.
Yeah, you're trying to exhale, and you just stop that process by closing the glottis. But typically, you would want you want to trap that pressure, right? So closing the glottis up here, you would want to create an ascension of the pelvic floor down lower to create the most trapped pressure, intrathoracically and intra-abdominally, to create a motion up. So yeah, that's not a bad focus to have it be about, like, an ascension of the pelvic floor. But if your breathing is well practiced, most exhalation should correspond to ascension of the pelvic diaphragm.
Yeah. Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So it won't have to be like Kegel, Kegel, Kegel. It'll just be like hiss or exhale or something like that, because you're so well practiced with that. But your inhale matters too. If your inhale was up in your neck, then you may not get that trampoline effect that you didn't get down into the pelvic floor so that it can come back up.
Because you're kind of losing that. I think I've heard Zach Couples talk about it. It's like a Coke can to a certain extent. Like if you're breathing up in here, you're losing that stack to a certain point, and then, like, you're creating a kink in the can, so you can't create as much pressure necessarily.
Right, you can't create as much vertical pressure. Right. What you can do, and this is what some of the compensations are, is like you can extend and lean back. Now this extension, it changes the trajectory a bit, so it becomes like less of a straight vertical and more of like an inclined pec.
Yeah.
But it also, your lats, they attach to the backside of the body, so more extension can correspond to more lat activity, which can give you more strength in different ways. So there's a lot of different ways to create like more force to move something. And that's another reason that it's important to describe your intent. But there is a value of like trying to learn how to create that intra-abdominal, intrathoracic pressure by being in a more neutral position, because in the neutral position would just be like the respiratory diaphragm over the pelvic diaphragm, because you do get a better use of that. If you're leaning back, you're kinking that, so that relationship isn't working as well. Doesn't mean you're not strong, and in some ways you may be stronger, because if you find, once you get into your like real maxes, like your real PR attempts, if you hit a sticking point, a lot of times you'll just start to go in that
Right.
direction in
Yeah.
some way. And it's a way of sort of balancing the bell under your body in a better lever.
Yeah.
To create
Well, like you think of strongmen, and it's
yeah,
like log pressing. Like it's basically an incline press because
yeah,
they're
right,
like so far back. But
yeah,
it's like they all use belts, which I feel like I'm just thinking could help with. I mean, any number of things. But if you're trying to create more pressure, that's just creating more pressure, and then they're also still getting that extension to use their lats more to a certain extent.
right,
But
right, and
uh,
yeah. So and it's often just you're just trying to get the weight balanced under you a little bit more. You also have to get your chin out of the way if you're
yeah,
trying to push there. So you don't want like the weight to come out in front of you
like
ever, right? Because that gets heavier. So you're trying to keep this line of drive,
yeah,
and it's often easier to move back. So bending back is easier instead of trying to like stay real locked in and move your whole torso there. You'll
yeah.
roll back a little bit, and then you can bring yourself back under when you clear a certain amount there.
Yeah.
Um,
The other thing I was thinking about talking about moving from the center out in turn if you're thinking of strict pressing and you're feeling it more in your middle versus in your extremities, is there ever a time like with hypertrophy would you ever just want almost the opposite, like you would not lose the center, but if you're trying to stress a distal muscle,
mhm.
you ever want to bring that stress more towards that, and like I don't know if I'm making sense, but this just came.
Sure. But I don't know. Like, I think it depends on how you look at trying to build hypertrophy. Like,
Yeah,
and I'm not a bodybuilder, so I don't know that I have like a good authority here to talk about this. But I do. It makes sense to me, like in any work that I try to do for hypertrophy, it's like do hard movements that you're working a lot of stuff
yeah,
all at once. So even if you're like trying to work your biceps, like I think of it as like go barbell, like do a standing barbell curl instead of trying to like do a single sided like concentration curl, just
yeah,
because there's just more stress that's being promoted there. So you can build more volume. And I like to think of it as like a volume thing. So I can do more weight total if I do like a barbell curl, and I can get more in its bilateral. So I don't think it's like about the feel of trying to isolate. I'm trying to
yeah,
think of it as like do more volume in less time so that I'm creating more stress, and then the body then has to respond to that stress.
right.
So
What?
that's more of the thought there. But if you do want to like really isolate something, so sometimes from like an injury perspective, you may want to like really try to create some stress specifically at a tendon.
Mm,
You might want to do that, but there's not really a need to really separate that out in your head,
yep.
because still teaching people how to move from the center out, you'll still get the stress that you're looking for down
Yeah.
the chain, but you'll feel actually stronger, so you'll be able to do more weight quicker,
Hmm.
right? You know what I
Yep.
mean? So what you're describing there would be like something that you feel more stressed with less weight in that area.
Right.
But I don't know that that's valuable. Like, because there's always a motor learning piece that I think should be involved in what you're teaching someone. So even if you're really doing isolated work, teaching the idea of like exhaling while you're contracting and having that correspond to a compression of your middle, like that's valuable, even if it feels very isolated to the muscle or tendon or whatever structure you're trying to stimulate.
Yeah.
And the person will often feel more safe doing that too,
Hmm.
because that doesn't feel like it's putting direct stress right on the area
Yep.
that might be injured.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think like the theory is there. I just don't know that there's
Yeah.
any practicality to
Yeah.
it.
No, and like I'm thinking now too, in the case of a like a bicep curl or something, it you tend to feel better if you're put yourself positionally in a better spot, whether it's like stacking the thoracic diaphragm over the pelvic diaphragm, whatever. But it's like that almost tends to just you feel it more where you want to feel it versus like if you're just like you know I I don't know, like almost cleaning the bar up. Like
Right.
you might just start feeling it like in your neck and your back, and like at that point you're not even.
Right.
So
You're not doing what you're intending to do.
right, yeah,
Now, what I would say there too is let's use like a standing bicep curl with a barbell as an example, and
mm,
then we can kind of extrapolate this to other movements where there's sort of this strict like slow tempo to faster movement continuum that
mhm,
you can go through. And when you are starting to think about like, oh, I can't do strict slow reps anymore, and you add what would look like a cheat into the mix, like by getting maybe a little bit of a hip pop into it, like a hip
yeah,
drive, that like the idea that that's unsafe, I don't know that that's actually true. I
yeah,
just think it's just an extension of like what you're doing there, and it's very similar to being done with reps on a strict press and then adding push presses into it. If
mhm,
you can think of it as the same thing, then you can actually direct your cheats when you're trying to do more reps to make it be like, okay, my arms are kind of done. So
it's
I
like a
can even like I can really lean back, or I can add like a little bit of like a little explosive hip help,
yep,
and then you can still keep going. So you're still creating this the stress stimulus that you're looking for, within a workout. And I think for stuff like hypertrophy, I think that's really helpful. I think
yeah,
that's some of the secondary reasons why like CrossFitters get real jacked because that's constantly, what's going on there. And there's a way to control that where you actually realize like, okay, this is what you're doing. Like you're going from a standpoint of like, all right, I'm starting with trying to keep a certain technique, but then as fatigue sets in, your technique changes, but then that's a different technique. It's not a cheat.
mhm,
It becomes like its own technique. So going from strict pull-ups right into kippings as you start to fatigue just so you can keep going, like there's a whole technique and skill to that,
yep,
right? And if you never get the first part though, like if you don't know how to do the first part, like you can't do a strict pull-up,
you
to
can't
me
do it.
it's not that the lack of safety in going right into kippings is that you've never developed the prerequisite strength to be
Right,
able to just actually pull yourself over a bar
yeah,
with your upper body. So now you're asking yourself to use those upper body muscles to accelerate and decelerate. Um, Although there is hip activity involved in that. So once you get the hip activity involved in the right way, you can sometimes bypass where the most strain would be on the shoulder. So
mhm,
it's hard to say generally that like kippings would be damaging to the shoulder because it really depends on how skilled you are at them and how you're doing them. Like how are you using them to get you over the bar? Because you can actually bypass some of the stress on the shoulders if you have the hip timing right. But oftentimes, like if you don't have the strength to pull yourself up, then you most likely also don't have the strength down the chain to coordinate the hips in the center to be able to pop yourself up and clear some of this stress and to be able to decelerate your body as you're swinging that
mhm.
way.
Did,
And you can kind of think of the same thing with push pressing, although and I mean I think it is slightly different where it's like there's a lot more your feet are on the ground, so the hip idea is a little bit easier to generate force like through a range that would be stressful for the shoulder.
mhm. Do you think that applies to muscle ups too? Because it's like you think, I feel like doing a strict muscle up, say on the rings, is way, like I feel like most people can get it with a kip before they can get it strict. So is there sort of a learning process to like maybe you start in that kipping sense, not where you're just tying multiple reps together, but like using it to just get there, and then you're slowly trying to get stricter before you open it back up again to tie consecutive kipping reps together?
Yeah, I would say, and then there's the sport of CrossFit, and then there's
Right.
the sort of like taking CrossFit and then backtracking and saying like, how can I make all of this stuff valuable to my movement practice, which is sort of like what I did when I was in the CrossFit community. I wasn't really competing that much, but I did find it valuable, like really valuable. And I was trying to figure out why, and I was trying to like make it a little bit more controlled. so that I can take it and use it with other people in coaching, but also like be more directed for how I train myself without having that competitive element to it. And one of the things that I definitely found was that there's a difference between teaching a kipping, like the idea of a kipping, and teaching any strict movement. Like they're part of the same category, but they're completely different. Like it's a skill to be able to kip,
Mm-hmm.
and it shouldn't necessarily be used to just get the skill so you can do more of it.
Right.
Right. It's basically controlling your hips and letting your hips make things easier on your upper body, which
Yep.
is the same thing of what a clean is, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing of what a snatch is. It's the same thing of what a push press is, a push jerk. Like it, and that is safer on your upper body, right? Like so, if you think about that, just from like why would we pick up something from the ground and bring it to our shoulder by using our hips? Because our hips are always going to be stronger and more powerful than our upper body. So if
Mm-hmm.
we're good at doing that in daily life, like that's going to be better for our upper body. We'll have less likelihood of injuring something. If we had to lock our legs and not use our lower body and curl everything from the ground to our shoulder, we would not be able to lift heavy things, and it would become very likely that we would strain something a lot more than we would if we were good at just kind of tossing it up and catching it.
Right.
Right. So in a way, like all kip work is a form of throwing yourself and catching yourself. That's the way that it has become evident to me. And it doesn't feel like that right away, but then once you start to get more of a flow with it, like a kipping pull-up is like you've used the hip and the coordination of the hip and maybe your spinal position with a whip and momentum to get you over there. So it's like you pull, but you don't have to pull nearly as hard.
Right.
So once you're really in the flow of it, it's like you're almost letting go with your hands and then catching the bar again. And you can really feel that. And if you've ever done a bunch of like, push presses one after the other, it starts to feel like that, where the arms, they don't get tired until later on because they're not doing nearly as much work. And that's what we're looking for. Right. So I think, in the functional sense, it's a valuable thing to learn how to use your hips to make it easier on your upper body.
Mm-hmm.
And we can think of kipping work as that, but it's also a valuable thing to have upper body strength, right? And control. And, you can assess some of the ranges of motion that you might need in your upper body, like by going slower, right? So I think strength work, if we think of it as like strict work, is slower movements. We have more time to assess like what we can and can't do. And there's a little bit more risk always when we just add velocity because it's harder to control. But if that velocity is being generated by our hips and we're bypassing some ranges that we might be limited with, and we can do that reliably and well, then it can be safe, and it's valuable to learn. Maybe not, you never have to do a kipping pull-up if you don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think if you put it into that category, it's valuable to learn how to use your hips to help your arms.
Mm-hmm. For so many reasons, and I almost think it's a form of movement variability in a sense, where if you fail out on strict and then you have that option, like if you're doing you have a performance-based goal to do a certain movement, and it's like you run out on strict, but then you can, if it's pull-ups, and then you can start kipping,
Right.
well, you just bought yourself more or whatever, better.
And that's certainly, in my experience, is helpful for, like, you want to feel like you're building muscle fast. I think
Yeah.
it's very helpful.
Yeah.
But you have to know how robust you are. You know what I mean? You really do. And part of like this conversation here, I think, is appreciating that it's a way of thinking of things not as like there's cut and dry rules, but
Mm-hmm.
then you have someone in front of you, or most people you see might not be appropriate for kipping pull-ups just because they're not robust and they're
Right.
nowhere near like that type of coordination. And
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about is the idea of generating hip power to help your arms. The attempt of getting them to try that might hurt them because they're just so far off.
Right.
Right. So we just have to appreciate that too. Who's your population? What is somebody coming in with? Like if someone doesn't have a goal of doing a kipping pull-up or something like that, I wouldn't I
Yeah.
wouldn't admit it. You know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. There's other things you can do,
Right.
but I do like to explain it that way because I've gone through the experience of learning that. And now, when I do pull-ups, like I do a lot of strict pull-ups, but if I'm doing, say, more, any higher rep pull-up workout and I'm getting to the point where I'm fatigued, I don't just get off the bar. Like I'll finish maybe the last two with a little bit of kipping, and I think that's completely safe, and I think it actually enhances what I can do if the goal is not necessarily to do more strict pull-ups, but if I want to use the pull-up to create like a hypertrophy stimulus. And I
Mhm.
think pull-ups are fantastic as a hypertrophy stimulus. Like I really do. I just think they're one of the best exercises you can do if you want your upper body to look a little bit bigger, but also it's your body weight that you have to be able to master, right?
Mhm.
So from a longevity perspective, you can look at like just gaining hypertrophy, like you're trying to gain mass, and you're just trying to get everything bigger, or you can look at it as like you're getting bigger for your body, like you're getting more muscle
Yep.
size and for your body, but you're still able to control your body really well. And I think body weight stuff gives you that opportunity in a way that external load doesn't. Like, so if you're just doing a lot of barbell stuff, fantastic if you want to create stress, but it shouldn't be about like the absolute load. It should be more of like the load relative to your body weight. And then when you look at something like pull-ups, like you don't even have to think load relative to your body weight because it's always the same. And it's like
Automatically.
the better you get at that, you're either getting stronger or you're getting lighter. And I think both are good things.
Right. Yep. For sure. Um, yeah, I feel like kipping's just one example, like you talked about, of just learning to use your hips to help your upper body. And I feel like, I guess, with Gen Pop, with just regular clients, like there's just maybe better ways to train that, I guess, whether it's like a kettlebell clean or even a swing, like you're just learning to use your hips to a certain extent.
Exactly. And what I would say is like, if I take the movements from CrossFit and you take away like the high volume,
Hmm.
and you just want to like think from a motor learning standpoint, you just want to teach somebody something. The teaching someone to do like one kip is really valuable. Like to do one good kip and then say like we don't need to do a lot of volume. Like
Yeah.
that can be valuable. I think more practically this is where the argument about are burpees a good thing or not. Well, if you take it out of the idea of how they're done from like a just try to make people sweaty standpoint,
Mhm.
and you look at, all right, I have somebody on their stomach, and let's say I have a 50-year-old lying on their stomach with their hands down, and I'm able to teach them to explode right up to their feet. Have I helped that person?
Mhm.
Yeah. Like, have I really changed something about it? Now, do I need them to do that 100 times? No. You know what I mean? Like it. But if I give them that ability by gradually deconstructing that movement, saying, okay, you're starting prone, hands down, you can initially step through and get to standing up, right? It is just getting from prone to standing. But if I can get someone to prone and jump, and they could be explosive with it, I've done something very healthy for that person,
Mhm.
right? And so if you look at it that way, I'm doing the same thing. I'm teaching someone how to use their hips, not more than their arms, right? So if you think of it as like a push-up, then step through, that's a totally different exercise, and there might be some value to that. That becomes like the strict burpee, where
Yep.
you go through like a push-up, and then you might like step forward one foot versus the other, right? I've called that the strong burpee in my book, which looks it's just like you've heard it called a man maker push-up and things like that too. But if that's the way that everybody gets off the ground every time they're on their stomach, then that's super inefficient, right?
Yep.
So if you can just be on your stomach and just explode up, that's like a sprawl, right? In MMA or something like that. There's a lot of value to that. And it becomes, again, you're not trying to just use your upper body, you're trying to drive your hips in such a way and have enough velocity to get them through that you can then land on your feet. So you threw your body and you caught yourself on your feet.
Yep.
And it's the same concept. So if you can teach someone to do that once, you did that person a very good thing. And, in my population, again, is the general population aging, right? So it's a really good thing for that population. Is it worth the time with an athlete? Probably not. Maybe,
Right.
I don't know, like maybe once, because they could probably get it a lot quicker, and then
Yeah.
we can add other things to it, right? It's like, okay, can you explode up and then go sprint or something
Hmm.
like that? Maybe there's some value to that.
Yeah.
I don't know. But just things need more context when you talk about like stuff being safe or unsafe, or like a good or bad exercise.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. It can't be simple. It can't just be simplified as
and,
good.
and, it, and it gets that way.
Yeah.
um, and I don't think, like, I was reading a post the other day. I think it was like Mike Boyle wrote a comment to John Russian. I don't know if you know who Mike Boyle
Yep.
is, right?
Yeah. And
John Russian.
yep.
He put something up about burpees, and like a couple people were just like, anytime you do a burpee, it's bad. And he was just trying to make a point, like, um, for like how you can program it safer and all that. And Mike Boyle said something like, don't sit on the fence. Like, don't be a fence sitter. Like, make a decision whether it's good or bad. I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and he knows what he's doing, obviously, from
Yeah.
a marketing but it's like that logic makes no sense. It's just like that becomes its own philosophy. It's like, don't sit on the fence. Like, you're supposed to like have a certain way about it, like with no context whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right. And
Like, why
that
do
to
you
me
need
is
to pick
the
sides?
opposite of
Yeah.
how you would want to think about things, like
Right.
that you would want to take a side without context. That would be the opposite of what you would ever want to do.
Right. That goes back to just like the danger sort of selling simple stories, I feel like.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It's an underestimation of complexity when you get really passionate about, one thing being right or wrong. It really is. And
Mhm.
that certainly will happen in the exercise world, about like what exercises are good and bad to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm laughing right now. I'm thinking of I mean, I love Pat Davidson and all his stuff, but like he went after the Turkish get up at one point. I was just it's like the
Yeah,
same.
and I've seen that FRC too. They've gone after and made fun of the Turkish get up, because it's like, well, nobody ever gets up like that. And it's like, well, that's not the point. You know what I mean? It never has been the point. When you actually do the movements and training, you realize like the value, and it's just having a kettlebell overhead and moving your body around that. You
Yep.
know, you can see like there's value to that. Like you start to gain different angles of your joint that you normally don't, and then the bell acts as an anchor. So that's the value right there. And if it's not necessarily about going as heavy as possible, but it's like sometimes that's part of what you want to do with your training. Sometimes you want it to just be like, all right, like a moderate load, and actually being able to explode that way, in which you now have this awareness of where your shoulder is with the bell overhead that you wouldn't have if you didn't have the bell overhead.
Yep.
Um, I just think, like, again, there's not enough context there, and sometimes it's good to, from a social media standpoint and from an audience standpoint, it actually is good to bash things, because for both, like, you'll get people that are passionate to disagree and passionate to agree. Um, but I think even those folks would certainly know, when you start talking about things in more context, they would agree.
Yeah.
It just
It-
might not be what they want to talk about in their post.
Absolutely. Yep.
So actually, Andrew Espina has a new podcast now, which I'm interested in, because I mean, he's a good speaker.
Yeah.
I like his philosophy on movement, and that would be good for you to start listening to a little bit, to
All right.
get into their world. I do like a lot of what they have to say, and I do think their stuff is really practically useful. And a lot of the debate that comes, and I don't know, call it debate, but a lot of like the criticism that they get is more that they're doing stuff that's already been done, which is
Yeah.
like, who cares? But they definitely add an element of like practicality for the fitness person that wasn't in, say, something like PNF. Right?
Yeah.
Like, PNF was more, towards people who have like neurological issues and things like that. And I just think, like, a lot of those neurological concepts, especially when you get into the more manual therapy stuff that they talk about, it's stuff to look into. Like, I got a lot out of their the way that they look at anatomy, the way that they describe why it might be important to go real specific with certain hands-on things, and how the mechanoreceptors in the body and the joint, work. And they talk about some of the evidence for that. No evidence, I think, is solid about any form of manual therapy right now. So I think that's the thing to appreciate. But they certainly they know where they're coming from, and they don't, I think, oversell what they're doing. And I think like that would be a good thing for you to look into, because I know you're very curious with some of these models, and you've done a lot with the intensive, you've done a lot with PRI. That's what you've been introduced to. Like that would be a good thing for you to look into, and
I'm
podcast.
looking at now. It's what's it called? Control Yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
The first one is all about, he's talking to another chiropractor about evidence, and it was pretty good. He was definitely like defensive about some of the stuff he's had to deal with from his community, or like the broad community of people that might be trying to criticize FRC. And that's got to be tough, I imagine, like when you put stuff up there and you put your own model out there and you have a following, you're going to get people that love it, and you're going to get people that give you shit about everything. And he gets a little defensive in the podcast, but the other guy that he's talking to is like really into the research and has a very good mind for explaining like what we know and what we don't know, and I thought it was helpful. But I'm interested in listening more to that, because
the other ones look interesting. There's the second one's with an MMA person and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter.
Right.
And then the third one's with a guy from Westside Barbell and an IFBB pro. So
yeah, so it'd be interesting.
Good mix.
Use that with all the different populations.
Yeah.
I think like that stuff is just, it's actually really easy to implement, and it's very effective, and it just can be added to anything from any of the other models.
Right.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Good. I think, any questions? I think that addressed some good stuff, and we can certainly talk more about that anytime. But
Okay. Cool. Great.
All right, man.